I'm not sure why it's any surprise, but December seems to be rushing by so quickly, so I'm so glad that I've got a drawing challenge to focus on, so that I have an excuse every day just to stop and lose myself in art for a little bit while all the excitement carries on around me. If this is the first video you're watching, I'm currently in the middle of a December drawing challenge. This is the third video, and the prompts for each of the challenges are inspired by some of my favourite Christmas moments and activities. The full list of the prompts is in the description if you'd like to draw along too. Today's prompt is a nutcracker, and I've been waiting for an excuse to draw a ballet themed illustration for so long, and I thought this would be the perfect fit. I'm using Procreate, and I've got my canvas set to 30 by 30 centimetres, 300 dpi, so it's not too big and it gives me loads of layers to play around with. I've blocked in the shapes that will act as the floorboards, the curtains, and I used a select tool, a screen layer and a really large textured brush to add the stage lights in the centre. After I'd filled in the triangle area that I wanted to cover, I used the select tool again to select two smaller triangles in the middle of that and use the same brush but as an eraser to just gently and with really low pressure erase some of the lighting to give more of a strobed effect rather than a straight block colour. On top of the curtain, I've added another layer and set it to multiply, and then I'm using the select tool to add shaded areas that I want to act as shadows. Instead of using really soft airbrush shadows, I'm using quite blunt graphic shapes because I think it matches the style of the illustration a little bit better. Underneath the multiply layer, I added a screen layer and drew a star pattern because it's a theatre, and if there's anywhere I can get away with being a little bit too much and a little bit dramatic, it's the theatre. The final detail to add to the curtain was the stitching detail along the edge. Instead of using a metallic overlay, I've just used a mustard yellow because when you put yellow next to reds or browns, it reads naturally as quite golden to the eye. And then the next step was to move on to the mouth, which I'm not going to lie, I was quite nervous for because I knew exactly how I wanted the dress to look in my head, but I had absolutely no idea how to pull that off in this illustration. I started by blocking in her head, her arms and her legs, and then outlining the silhouette of the dress, and on a separate layer, silhouette of her sleeve. Selected the layer that I'd drawn the dress on and then hid the layer and added a new one on top, so the area was still selected but the block of colour was no longer there. And then I used a large texture brush and applied quite a lot of pressure to the top and just a little bit of pressure towards the end so that it created a gradient of opacity and gave the impression of a kind of layered tulle fabric. I duplicated that layer, and with the second version of the layer I lowered the opacity and set it to multiply and swiveled it just slightly so it was a few millimeters to the left, and then I repeated those steps again, but this time moving a few millimeters to the right to give the impression of multiple layers of tulle and movement. The final step was to select the original layer again, still keeping it hidden, but this time adding a screen layer on top and using a spray paint brush to give the impression of glitter. All that was left to do was to use the airbrush pen to erase the tops of her legs to give the impression of them gradually being hidden beneath the layers of her dress. For the sleeve, I just kept it really simple and I set the layer to screen and then reduced the opacity so that the top of her arm was like peeking through underneath. I then added a multiply layer on top to give the impression of a flutter sleeve. Then on a separate multiply layer that I popped beneath the sleeve, I added some shadows to where the edge meets the dress and her arm. I'm not quite finished with the dress, but the feet look so weird without the shoes on, so I'm adding them in now just because they keep distracting me so much. I only filled in like the top of her foot rather than her whole foot, so without the bottom of her shoe, it just looks so bizarre. That's so much better. I added some shadows to where they met her skin and where the ribbons overlapped on her legs, and then I popped back over to finish the dress. I've added a screen layer over the top of the last layer we were just working on, and using white and the dry ink brush, I'm just adding some stitch details and some bows onto her sleeve. I know everyone has probably reached bow fatigue at this point, but I'm firmly in the camp of bows being a forever accessory and not a fleeting trend, and in this context of ballet and Christmas, I think they make perfect sense. To the skirt of her dress, I'm also adding the same star pattern that we added earlier to the curtains of the stage, just to exaggerate the glitter effect. I know I say this about every illustration, but I had so much fun drawing this mouse. When I was a kid, I was so in love with Angelina Ballerina, and the illustrations by Helen Craig were one of the main reasons that I ever dreamt about becoming an illustrator in the first place. I was so in love with the world that she and Catherine Hollibird created, and just ballet in general thanks to them. There was a dance shop in town, and seeing their window displays with the tutus and the shoes was my favourite thing ever, even though I don't think we ever stepped foot inside once. My mum bought me tickets to see Swan Lake when I was about 7, and I have a chronic illness, and I remember feeling so poorly that night and fighting for my life to stay awake despite how sleepy my medicine made me, but being so completely and utterly mesmerised by the dancers on the stage and how the light hit their costumes. Even now as an adult, whenever I go to the theatre, costume and stage design are the two areas I look forward to seeing most in a performance. I'm such a strongly visual person, and I know sometimes aesthetics are dismissed as being quite shallow aspects of anything, but I don't think that's necessarily true or fair. There are whole areas of academic research that show that our visual environment has huge impacts on our mood, our mental well-being, and how we engage on a social level with one another. I think it's important not to dismiss the things that bring you joy just because they're seen as frivolous or silly or childish, like glitter or a sugar plum fairy. I think it's important to greet those things with curiosity and take note so that you can fill your life with as many as possible, because it's so easy to find reasons to be sad these days, but finding small little glimmers of joy, no matter how little, can have a really big impact. Now that the mouse is pretty much done for now, I'm going to quickly move on to the floor before moving on to the nutcracker. I'm using a turpentine paintbrush to add a wash of texture first, and then using the dry ink brush on a multiply layer to draw in the floorboards, trying to make them look as higgledy-piggledy as possible, which honestly sometimes I think it's so much harder trying to make something look random than it is to make an orderly pattern, but it's just one of those things where you have to try things out as you go along and erase and adjust as you need to. I lowered the opacity so the contrast wasn't too glaring, and then I added a screen layer underneath and added some texture with the dry brush. I know it looks really bizarre and so wrong, but please just trust the process. I promise in 2 seconds it's going to make perfect sense once I adjust the opacity. Actually, that applies to almost all of my illustrations. Please trust the process. They all look really ugly in the middle, but I promise they usually work out. And then at long last it was finally time to draw the star of the show, the Nutcracker himself. Before I started this illustration I did some research, because while they're one of my favourite Christmas decorations, I had no idea where the tradition came from. So nutcrackers as a tool with which to crack nuts have existed as far back as ancient Greece, but the decorative carved nutcrackers that we know today originate from the Ore Mountain region in Germany, whose German name I'm going to put on the screen because despite watching many YouTube videos, I still can't quite pronounce it properly. The region was once a thriving mining community, with families earning their income from the natural silver and tin that they mined there. But as the natural resources began to dry up and not wanting to leave their homes, they instead adapted and turned to the traditional crafts of the region, and just like that, a new artisan industry based in wood carving was created. Developed somewhere around the early 16th century, original German nutcrackers took the shape of animals and birds and nature, but by the 18th century, as skills developed and tastes changed, they began to take the form of the soldiers and kings that we recognise today. The nutcrackers quickly became popular collectible pieces around the region, and throughout wider Germany, people particularly enjoyed using the nutcrackers fashioned after the ruling class, so church leaders, policemen, kings, soldiers for example, as a tool of expressing their dissatisfactions, taking joy in seeing those in positions of power reduced to nothing more than crackers of nuts. As the mines dried up and the crafting industries took over, German nutcrackers became one of the most popular crafts for people to own and collect and display, being most prominent at Christmas simply due to the fact that this was the period when people ate the most nuts in an effort to reserve energy over the long winters. It wasn't until Tchaikovsky's ballet The Nutcracker Suite in 1892 that the German Nutcracker reached worldwide notoriety. A two-act classical ballet set on Christmas Eve in a child's imagination cemented the Nutcracker as a Christmas tradition. Tchaikovsky based the ballet on a French play by novelist Alexandre Dumas, who had adapted the 1816 novel The Nutcracker and the King of Mice by E.T.A. Hoffmann into a play for children in 1845. Almost 100 years later, in 1934, the ballet gained worldwide acclaim after a performance in London, and the German nutcrackers have been produced and collected ever since, although their use of mockery for the ruling class has kind of fallen out of fashion. I'm so happy with how he looks. I think he looks so much fun. I'm going to try and make gift tags out of him and the ballerina for my Christmas presents. Hopefully they work. I think my niece and my nephew would love them so much. I've been so surprised by how much I'm loving the art that I've made over this challenge. I was quite nervous at the beginning. I was worried I would maybe find it difficult or maybe even reach burnout, because all of these prompts aren't things that I'd normally be drawing, but they've all been so much fun, and I have so many new ideas of things that I'd like to draw in the new year now. I can't believe how quickly December is going. We're nearly a third of the way through and Christmas is in a week and a half. I love this time of year so much, and I'm trying to soak up every second as much as possible. I just wish I could slow it down so I could enjoy it just a little while longer. I'm adding some final texture to the ballerina's dress just because it's looking a bit clean isn't the right word, maybe soft. It just needs that little bit more texture, I think. And I'm using the same technique that I used on the nutcracker's coat and on the floorboards, where I'm using the dry ink brush, setting the layer to screen, and then just lowering the opacity slightly, so it's something that you can see but it doesn't draw too much attention. It just brings everything together. I'm doing the exact same thing on the stage light as well, adding some streams of light and then some stars and some sparkles to bring everything to life. And then I mentioned earlier about wanting to try a few different things to the dress, but waiting until all of the other elements are in first place. And it's finally time to do that now. Her dress isn't looking particularly Christmassy at the moment, so I wanted to try adding a few little red details. I've added a little bow to her head and then changed the colour of the shoes. I wasn't sure if I was going to like them, but I absolutely love them. I think it looks so good. I think it just takes it from looking like a normal ballerina to a Christmas specific ballerina. And then just to tie everything in, I'm adding little dots to her sleeve and some stitching details, and then it's all finished. Thank you so much for watching today's video. She was such a joy to work on. If you're drawing along, I hope you had so much fun too, and if you liked today's video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!